typical 15, 20 seconds as we get all these platforms synced up and make sure that we're rolling. How have you guys been? Well, obviously more than guys, how's everyone been? We're excited to be here today. These are some of our final live streams before the premiere of Grounded. If you don't know and haven't heard about the Your Story Matters campaign by Rhino, here's the scoop. So about 2 months ago at this point, we reached out to you, our audience, and asked you to submit a story that was meaningful to you. And then we'd help give that story a voice. So we selected a few of those stories, put them together, wrote a treatment, started from that ground zero of this project, and then went on and produced this. All along the way, we've been able to work with several different great influencers in the industry who have helped take this from one place to an even better place. And so we're excited to do more of that today as we dive deep into post-production. And so if you have any questions throughout the stream, you know what to do, hit the comments. And so we'll be able to address those as best as possible as we go throughout the stream today. To introduce our guest, we'll be talking today to Ollie Kenchington, and he's from clear on the other side of the world. We're excited to have him. If you haven't heard about Ollie, let me give a little bit of background. He's got several MZ courses out. So MZ's been a sponsor of this project, so go be sure to check that out. A lot of those courses are actually on color grading, and that's what he's really known for. But obviously, anytime you get into production, you're going to go through that whole process. So we know that Ollie's a fantastic editor as well, even award-winning. And so we're excited to talk to him, even from this perspective of what would you wish you could edit as a colorist that didn't make it in the edit. And so he's had a chance over his career to work with some major brands like Canon, Apple, and RHS. And so Ollie, we're so excited to have you on today. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Brandon. Thanks so much for inviting me to chat to you guys today.
Absolutely, we're excited to have you.
So, thank you. Yeah.
To start off, tell us a little bit about how you got into production and what guided your life into the world of video.
Yeah, so originally my background was in fine art. I studied fine art at university, but it was during that time that I discovered video. At that point, it was a very strange kind of video meets art kind of world. I remember studying people like Steve McQueen, who at that point was making art installation videos. And I very quickly ascertained that there was no money to be made as a video artist. And like Steve McQueen, I've dedicated my career since to becoming more commercially viable. Yeah, worked for Apple initially, and actually worked as a post-production trainer. So originally I started out teaching people Final Cut Pro, Color, if you remember Color back in the day, Apple's color grading platform. And then I eventually left Apple and set up my own company in 2008 called Coro Films, which is a video production company here in the UK. And through that whole time, shooting, editing, and grading my way to this moment now. These days, as you rightly said in your introduction, I'm mostly act as a colorist. I'm in my color suite here now. I'll quickly cut to my rather underexposed and dirty extra angle here, but this is my grading suite. And as you said, mainly grading these days. But the reality of running a video production company is that you don't always get the luxury of outsourcing each different part. We do actually have full-time editors now, but with everything that's happened this year, losing a couple of members of staff, I've been editing more this year than I have in years. And actually, it's been lovely. I've always absolutely loved editing. It seems to me to be one of the most kind of pure aspects of the storytelling process within all of filmmaking. I think all of the other parts, you need to really be able to step back to see where it's going to fit within the end piece. But editing, for me, it's where you really roll your sleeves up and craft that story, which is what we're trying to do. So it still excites me a huge amount. And yeah, as you pointed out, I've won awards for stuff that I've edited, and still thoroughly enjoy that process.
That's awesome. Well, congrats on that. And you know, congrats on staying afloat in this turbulent time. It's
Yeah,
challenging, and so love the ability to be able to pivot and stay relevant. And so we'll talk a bit more about some of the new projects you're working on later on as
sure.
well in terms of grading. So looking forward to that too. For me, I like you. I love editing, but at the same time, when you're a small production, to me, editing can be terrifying because you've done all the pre-production, you've done the actual production, and then there's this void where for me it's like, did I actually get what I wanted, what I was envisioning this whole way along? And so there's sometimes where I sit for a bit before I hop into the edit. What do you do to sort of breach that chasm and just get into the edit and have that right mindset?
It's, you're absolutely right, and it is tricky. What's interesting as you move further up in this industry, they've solved a lot of that as you say, chasm that comes between the end of production and the beginning of post-production by actually doing those two things almost simultaneously. Almost all films are edited whilst they're being shot, for the simple reason that it saves money, because if the editor spots that there's bits crucial to the story development that are missing, that weren't captured in principal photography, then they can get those pickups, and they can do that with a second unit. They can do it at the same time, and they can weave them into their schedule so they're not losing time, and they're not having to get they're not having to get talent and locations and everything all back in place. So yeah, I completely understand what you mean, and it'd be lovely if we were operating at that end of the industry, but as it is, we don't often, or indeed ever, get the chance personally to have stuff where dailies are going back and being edited and rough cuts are being assembled for scenes whilst we're still in production. So to answer your question, to kind of bridge that gap, I think one of the really crucial ways, which interestingly plays in really closely with what you were talking about last week, when you were running, in conjunction with the music bed, and you were talking about scoring. A lot of directors play music on sets. They use music to get actors into the right emotional space for when they're delivering their lines. And I actually use music in our productions. I pick that music often during pre-production, and that kind of weaves the emotional arc for me throughout the entire process, from actually before we shoot all the way through. And I think coming back to that, particularly if you have, as I do, picked your music really early in the process, I think that's a great way to just kind of engage yourself back into that frame of mind. I think if you spend too much time kind of rereading script or script notes or anything like that, you can end up kind of losing your thread. So I think the best thing to do is just start, pick a scene, maybe pick a scene that's that you remember just came together really well in production, that you remember there were really good performances. We all have those moments during production where we're watching, we're just like, you get that tingle, this is actually going to be exactly how I imagined it. Maybe start with one of those scenes to really kind of gently ease yourself in. But you're right, there is a mindset that needs to kind of be engaged. Another thing that I'd really strongly recommend, which goes for all editing across all genres, is to make sure that your workflow is really strict. Workflow is a really boring word. It gets bandied around an awful lot. But the reason why workflow is important to me is that it helps you focus by compartmentalizing everything. You really boil everything down to an iterative process where you do something as a pass, and then when it's done, you go back to the beginning, and then you start again with the next tier. And that kind of iteration, that workflow, I think really helps breach that gap between production and post-production, because it makes it all very small. It takes a big problem and it reduces it down to a series of small things that you can just keep going over and over. And before you know it, the bare bones are there and you're away, basically.
Yeah, that's some great advice. So I grew up being a bit of an artist, and I loved just using my hands for anything I could create. And I had this same workflow problem that unfortunately some of it still persists today. And that's, I'd start the sketch, I'd get the underlay going, I'd start, outlining if it needed it, but then I'd like want to hop to color right away. you know? And so I'd have all of these drawings that I'd like never end up finishing because I'd have one corner that was drawn. I was like, yeah, that looks cool. Or it didn't look like I wanted it to. So I'd end up scrapping it. And sometimes that happens with film where I'm just like, I really want to get to grading because that's, you know, where it gets to that image that I wanted in my mind. And so, but then you know, obviously with video, if you're doing that and you're adding all of that, it's going to slow down your whole workflow just because it's so cumbersome on your machine to get into some of these grades. So very great advice.
Yeah, I see a lot of people doing it when they're new to editing. They and it's weird actually. I'm certain I have this strong theory that it's made worse by the way that NLEs are designed. Not all of them. I notice you use Final Cut Pro, and I also use Final Cut Pro 10 because it actually is one of the few programs that goes against what I'm just about to say. A lot of NLEs present the end user with a timeline straight away. One of the first things that you see. And I'm sure that when you're starting out, a lot of people teach themselves in this industry a surprising amount. I always make this joke, you know, can you imagine if you walked into a hospital and like put your hand up if you're self-taught, and you know all the doctors put up their hands, and yet you walk into a lot of production companies and you say, you know, who taught themselves here? A lot of people do. Maybe it's just this country, but there's a real dearth of very good quality film schools where you get a high level of technical tuition. Most people who are studying film, I've observed, are often kind of, you know, told, oh, this is a practical course, you know, here's a camera, off you go. And it's, you know, it's a very easy sell to a student who are kind of, you know, they're mostly interested in just having fun for 3 years. But, you know, actually, if you look at it, the technical training and tuition with filmmaking is really important because if you're left to your own devices, you tend to just work in an intuitive way, and that you can actually get by with that in certain fields. I think directing, definitely you can get away with that in huge amounts, but there are certain things, and editing is one of them, where you really need to understand technically what you're doing, because the way that you end up intuitively teaching yourself to edit if you're left to your own devices is taking all of your rushes, chucking them on a timeline, and just sort of vaguely going through and rearranging stuff until you find a bit that works. The analogy I always use is it's like a puzzle. So the correct way to make a puzzle is also the most boring way. The more fun way to make a puzzle is just to tip all the pieces on the table and just kind of scurry through them and just you know, randomly push them around until you find a couple of bits that fit together. And what that does is it instantly or very quickly gives you that gratification of, you know, you found bits that work together. And then you put that down into a sea of just nonsense. And you're like, oh, I better start again. And if you keep following that workflow, eventually you end up where you've got a big collection of small bits that work and no coherence whatsoever. The proper way, the boring way to make a puzzle is to go through and find your corner pieces first and stack them up, and then go through and find all your edge pieces and stack them up, and then go through all of your middle pieces and stack them up, and then start to work through the middle pieces and separate them into color groups, because it's likely that, you know, the blues are all going to be part of the same object somewhere within that picture. And eventually you start placing things down. And when you're putting them down, although it's taken you longer to get to that point, because you've done so much organization up until that point, the actual story, the picture in this case, presents itself much more vividly and also more quickly at that stage. So it's kind of you know, a bit of a delayed gratification, but it's how to my mind at least, that's how editing should be done. You should be the boring puzzle maker when you're an editor.
Yeah, you know, that's a great analogy that gets you, it helps to get me in the right frame of mind. Because for sure, unequivocally, if you sit down and have two people side by side doing the same puzzle, and say even it's the same individual just at different times, that way is going to beat it time and time again in terms of completing the execution and having that coherence. So great analogy.
It can feel a bit robotic. I would say it definitely can feel like maybe you're missing the soul when you're doing it that way. But I would argue that robotic nature, that predictable, iterative approach, what it means is that when the time comes, which to my mind is when you start trimming and when you start looking at the the scenes and the story elements, and deciding where can I remove stuff, how can I tell this story quicker. There's a huge amount of value in practicing the art of cutting stories down. It really helps you focus on key story elements. And it was going to be one of my tips I was going to mention later, that if someone's creating a short, arbitrarily give yourself a test by making it half the length that you end up with, just to test yourself, just to see, because it really makes you focus. And I think if you are quite predictable and robotic almost in that mechanical iterative workflow approach, although it's quite dry, it does mean that you get to the stage where you can see the big picture quicker, and that's where you can then allow yourself that freedom, that time. You have the time by that stage to focus on that story and really refine it. Whereas if you're doing it the other way, it takes up more time. So most people have a deadline. There's very few times where you don't have some type of deadline, even I'm sure for this project that you're doing. The thing is, if you get up to that deadline and you've done that more messy approach, some might call it a more creative approach, then you've actually had less time to really think about the nuance and the subtlety of the way that story is developing, because it's taking you longer to get to that big picture stage. So I do think that, as I say, it's worth approaching editing that way, just to allow yourself the time to really create the best story that you can.
Well, very good. That's all very practical advice, and looking forward to going through some of this. So just to catch everyone up and be on the same page here, Ollie has not seen any of this film that we're about to show him the intro to. And so we're going to hop into this, and I know that there's some fat to trim, and we've got the basic elements of sound design. We have the voiceover in there that is going to be this radio announcer that's sort of just in the background. The main character, just for you, Ollie, he has gone through a tragic loss. His father recently passed away, so now he's dealing with the burden of that. And just habitually, he's in the home where he grew up in, and he has the radio on, just to be a reminder of Dad. And it just happens to be talking about a subject that's relevant to his family's background. So I'm going to hop over to the screen share, and we're going to hop into Final Cut, which is the best editor.
I think we're at a time now where you can actually say that as well and not be limited.
I was an early adopter of Final Cut 10, and I just haven't been able to go back, because the magnetic timeline, in terms of assembling, in terms of grouping, like I love what we've got going here, right? Like just have a slug down where I can tag all of my different audio elements to, but then I have this that takes full advantage of that magnetic timeline, and I can move that group, but I can still have that group visible. I love that, just because time-wise, like you said, we all have deadlines, and this has a deadline. In fact, a week from now, we will be premiering this film, so there's lots to do. But we're going to show roughly the first about 2 minutes. So we're going to hop into this. Hopefully, let me know if you can hear it. You should be able to pretty clearly, but we'll dive right in.
I think we can all agree that this year has gone different than we planned.
Say that again.
Despite this pandemic that's raged across the world, there's been at least one change for the better. More people are getting outside. Who knew it would take a worldwide pandemic to get people to look up from their screens? That being said, with the recent return of Bob and Doug from the International Space Station, space is trending at an all-time high. Stargazing has become a popular pastime. In our modern world, that's easier said than done. For most, simply walking out the front door and looking up won't give you a very impressive view, as light pollution dominates our suburban skies. In fact, a new atlas of the night sky across the entire globe shows that more than 80% of the planet's land areas and 99% of the population of the United States and Europe live under skies so blotted with man-made light that the Milky Way has become virtually invisible. Can you believe that? It's right above us every night, yet we're blinded by the light. All this space talk is making me nostalgic. Let's turn back the clock and listen to some classic tunes from the space race of the 60s.
So we'll have that music cue in here. Obviously, we've got to find one on MusicBed that's licensable and feels of that era. So it'll be playing here in the background and then be this reminder. All right, so we'll cut there, and this is where the mood begins to change. We'll obviously still be hearing some of that music in the background, but definitely there's, from this point of peak of frustration to kind of gaining some of his senses, and then going back, basically reflecting on some memories from his father. There's a range of emotions that we're trying to convey here. So right off the bat, Ollie, what are your thoughts, and what can we do and be as mean as possible here? Let's make this good.
It's, do you know what? It's tricky because there is, other than radio, there's no dialogue. So you don't have any interplay with anyone else. There's no dialogue, which is a really, really tricky thing to do, actually. It's probably one of the hardest things to do in editing. I like the idea that the radio helps kind of do that. In fact, one of the things that is really useful when there is dialogue is to create what is known as a radio edit, so that you have something that sounds like you could be listening to on a radio, and it sounds, that the pace and everything is set nicely. And the nice thing about that is if you've got something that sounds right and the pace feels good, it's almost inevitable that once you match some visuals with that it will work really well, because sound plays such an important part, as you've already covered before. So obviously with no dialogue from our protagonist here, it's very difficult to kind of get that right, so that the radio ends up being the thing that kind of is leading you forwards. You're also trying to do an awful lot. You're trying to tell an awful lot of story and as you say, foreshadow quite a lot that's happening, all in a short space of time. It's very difficult because I don't know how much further on this scene might develop, and what other influences might come in to kind of do this. And it's also worth noting, and this sounds like I'm a get out of jail free card, but there are a million different ways to edit even 2 clips, let alone an entire film. And really there's no right way. I've learned time and time again that there's no right way to edit anything, really. I've actually, as I say, I teach and I've been doing training for years, teaching editing for years, and there are some stock sort of clips and rushes that I have used as training material for years, absolutely years. Some of it was just sort of part of, I think at the time would have been Apple's like Final Cut Pro training series media. It just kind of kicks around and hangs around for years. And whenever we're, as a company, whenever we're advertising for editing staff, I always send the same training material that just lives on our Dropbox. I send it to them and say, just download this and cut it together. And it's a good way of seeing what they can do with it. And genuinely, some of this stuff I've seen edited probably 1,000 different ways over 7 or 8 years, and still you'll just sometimes see someone do something with it you've just never seen before. You've never seen that story told in that way. So there is no right way to edit anything. The thing I think you need to get right, which is a really hard balance, is to not spoon feed your audience. It's probably one of the most tempting things when you're starting out. It's very hard when you do your first anything, whether it's a narrative like this or commercial promo or whatever it might be, it's very hard to see beyond the treatment that you've come up with, the script that you've come up with, whatever it might be, the way you've developed a brief. It's very hard to get out of that and see it with anyone else's eyes. And it's also very hard when you've then shot that to get rid of anything. They call it in editing, it's called killing your babies. Because, like when the shot where you're in the bin and he brushes the cereal and the glass into the bin, I bet that took you a long time to get that shot. There's a lot of that's gone into the production of getting that shot. And if I said to you, oh, that's got to go, that shot, that doesn't help, get rid of that. I'm not going to say that. But if I were to say that, it would be such a wrench, I'm sure, because you'd remember how much went into getting that particular shot. Hence why it's called Killing Your Babies. It's a real gut wrencher to kind of get rid of anything when you've taken all this time to produce and create this content. But this is where it's very useful getting other people to see it. It's very useful to go away, because not everyone has, Rhino behind them and the ability to go and talk to all of these different people about an edit. A lot of people just edit on their own and they don't necessarily have anyone to kind of bounce off. I would say in those cases, go with your gut instinct, try and be kind of true to whatever the original vision was, or if it's a brief come from a client, but step away, sleep on it and come back. And I always like, say, put on a different hat. You take off your sort of friendly, let's try and keep everything in their hat, and then you put on your slightly more ruthless hat, where you just get rid of anything that doesn't tell your story as quickly as possible. So I am actually not going to commit to any particular shot in there, but I have a general feeling that there's definitely one or two bits that could be either removed or trimmed down heavily. I think maybe the one that sticks out in my mind is the lingering shot on the phone.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult to ask people to watch a video of text.
Yes.
It's really, really hard. Anytime you see it on screen, there's almost always an editing trick that's involved, either a voiceover. So if it's someone reading a letter that someone has sent to them, it might come on in voiceover, or they'll use a trick in editing where they'll see someone start to read and then it'll cut to the end, which takes advantage of a human response where we predict movement constantly. So you can actually take out chunks of time that in reality took place. And then you can remove them and people don't notice, or they forgive that jump in time because they already had predicted it happening. I think it might be worth employing a few of those techniques with this section. Maybe, for example, this wider shot, really the only thing that I could read was the subject. We regret to inform you. That tells me everything I need to know. It's some kind of disappointment. Maybe it's really important about the name of the company. Maybe some other part of this email is particularly important to the narrative later that's at the moment lost on me because I don't know what's coming. But if it isn't important who this email's from, what it contains, if the only important thing is that it's some kind of knockback to him, it's some kind of rejection, and that's simply just all it needs to be, just to illustrate that this is a guy who's been a little bit beaten down, then I'd suggest you don't need to push in. You don't need to cut into that closer shot of the email, because you can actually read that subject. Your eye is immediately drawn to that top subject line anyway. But I don't know. I mean, is there more to it that I'm missing?
No, and this was my biggest thing that I have not liked about this piece thus far, because one, asking anyone to read while watching a movie is ludicrous, because that's why you're watching a movie. I mean, and so I actually struggled with the length of the shot because we had this rack focus, which I thought that at first, like as we were producing, this is just going back to the sort of production day, I thought that these would have come through a bit more as bills, but it turns out it's actually really hard to make out, especially at least that they're medical bills. I actually don't even think that that's super critical as I've been in the edit. I've just said, you know what, you just know that this is stressful. I mean, it's a mess, it's stressful. And so we get a bit more of that. And so I would prefer to remain on this where you get a little bit more of an inkling that, hey, this is medically related, and then just it racks to that we regret to inform you, and then cuts to the slamming the phone. Because this was the scene that was pretty crucial, and I thought he did a great job portraying just that gut-wrenching feeling. So
yeah, I hate to say this because obviously there's nothing you can do about it now, and hindsight is a wonderful thing. But if you had got a rubber stamp, overdue, anything like that, and stamped that big across those letters, you wouldn't have needed the phone shot at all. You could have. There's enough justification that it's just all overwhelming to him because he's in debt. I'm guessing that all there needs to be is a trigger for him that he's had enough. That's all it needs to be. So the phone, I agree, actually, because it's not obvious what those letters are. I kind of guessed they were Bill's, but it wasn't until I saw the phone and saw the subject line saying, "We regret to inform you." It wasn't until then, and he kicks off, that you then understand that he's, this is all too much, and he's kind of had enough. It's after that you then think, oh, maybe they weren't Bill's, maybe those were rejection letters from other companies he's applied to jobs for or something. So, but regardless, I definitely don't think you need to then cut in to the phone. It's also a clumsy visually. It's aesthetically, it's not very pleasing to kind of push in like that to kind of jump in. So kill it.
Yes, it's killed. It's gone. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to throw some things out, and so we'll continue to do that. We've got some good questions coming in here from the group as well. So let's actually shift a little bit and address some of these things. We've got some people that have talked about just the shift from they were in Final Cut but went to Resolve just because it's a much deeper program in terms of what you can do with the color. But they've had issues with round tripping. I've also had that same issue. So I've kind of gone back and forth deciding, do I want to start in this program round trip, or how do I want to do that? Do you have any advice for people that are, kind of on the fence about some of those decisions?
Yeah, it's very personal to each individual. I'm obviously a colorist by trade and entirely set up around DaVinci Resolve. I couldn't be more invested in DaVinci Resolve. So it would seem even more unusual than that I would choose to edit in Final Cut Pro. Blackmagic won't like me saying this. I do think that, DaVinci Resolve has come on leaps and bounds. It's a fantastic video editor. If I was a Premiere user, I would jump across to Resolve in a heartbeat. It's incredible value for money, even if you pay for the studio version, let alone obviously if you get the free light version. And if you are already using a track-based NLE, I wouldn't think twice about recommending people moving to Resolve, whether they, color grade or not. It's an incredibly full-featured program. The problem, and you said this yourself, the problem is, as an early adopter of Final Cut Pro 10, and also as a teacher of Final Cut Pro 10, so it's been my job since it came out in 2011. So the first version of Final Cut Pro that I used was version 2. The first version of Final Cut Pro that I became certified to train, to teach people on, was Final Cut Pro 5. So Final Cut Pro 6 came out, Final Cut Pro 7 came out. I taught 5, 6, and 7, then 10 came out, by which point, that was 2011, by which point I already had a relatively healthy freelance training business going. So it was purely a business decision for me to continue offering Final Cut Pro 10 training. If I hadn't have had that business interest in it, I would have done what everyone else did and just moved to Premiere, because I hated Final Cut Pro 10 when it came out in 2011. It was unfinished, it was useless, and it should never have been released when it was. But because I did, and because I had to stick with it, and because I was teaching it, I had to not just learn how to use it, but learn how to use it inside out, every single feature of it, to a level where obviously I was teaching. I'm still an Apple certified master trainer, so I needed to know it inside out. And because of that, I've now realized just how good it is. A lot of people who hate on it, understandably, and this is completely Apple's fault, they haven't discovered how to use it properly. And quite rightly, people don't want to spend the time learning how to re-edit. You know, time is money in this game. You haven't got time to just completely learn a new platform just because Apple decided to do some things differently. If you do persist with it, you realize they've done things differently for a damn good reason, and it is an incredibly fast, seamless process editing in Final Cut Pro 10. The whole track thing, if I'm ever presented now with a track-based NLE, whether it's Resolve or Premiere or anything else, and I should say I'm an Adobe certified instructor in Premiere, not that I've done it for years, but I am technically still. And obviously I teach DaVinci Resolve editing and color grading and everything in that. But if you are used to Final Cut Pro, where it's completely done away with tracks and the magnetic timeline and really understanding how it works, it is lightning fast. It really is. And it allows you to focus on what you should be focusing on when you're editing, instead of patch panels and, you know, auto select buttons to make sure things go onto the right track everywhere. You know, Final Cut Pro takes a different approach. It's far more organic, makes far more sense from a storytelling point of view. And, you know, I thought it was a bit, you know, over the top when it first came out, and, you know, it's not a track, it's a storyline, you know, and I thought, oh, Jesus, you know, typical Californians. But actually, there's real merit to it. The secondary storyline, the way that works, the way it gets you to focus on assembling a radio edit and then adding in things that secondarily support that primary storyline, it does make perfect sense. What I do in terms of the question, in terms of color, as a colorist, I use DaVinci Resolve. If you come to me and say, I need this graded, it's going to be done in Resolve. I'm not even going to think twice about that. But I also run a corporate film production company, so we also have to grade and finish our own projects. And there's almost never a separate color grading budget for that. You know, if our editors are finishing off something and editing it in Final Cut Pro, you're right, the round trip is a pain. So I don't round trip it to Resolve just so I can grade it. I just grade it inside Final Cut, just grade it. I just grade it inside Final Cut Pro 10 because the color tools in Final Cut Pro 10 are really good. If you can wrap your head around the fact that you've basically got pretty rudimentary keying, although it's got a lot better recently, and basically no windows or tracked windows, certainly. If you can get your head around that and just think of it as a primary, predominantly primary balance tool set, it's more than good enough. And you'll be surprised, if you know what you're doing, you'll be surprised how good the color tools can be put to good use in Final Cut Pro. And just as one basic illustration of that point, back in April, around Easter time, I work an awful lot with Canon. I wear a lot of hats. So I also work a lot with Canon, with, you know, cameras and camera releases and testing cameras and workflow with them. And back when the C300 Mark III came out, I was the first person in the UK to get given a C300 Mark III just prior to its release, to its announcement, and to shoot with it. And you know, I shot some nice stuff, a bit restrictive because the whole country was in lockdown, but got some nice stuff around where I live, cut that together in Final Cut Pro, graded all of it in Final Cut Pro, and off that went. And the number of people who would actually genuinely wouldn't believe me when I said that it was all graded inside Final Cut Pro 10 was hilarious. You know, I had one guy in a forum, I can't remember which site it was on, but he just wouldn't accept that I had graded it in Final Cut Pro. He said it can't possibly be graded in Final Cut Pro. I was like, well, it has. It's just a bit of contrast and a bit of saturation. But I guess if you know what you're doing with those tools, then you know you can get good results. So it might be that those people don't need to make a choice of round tripping or not. It might just be that they just need to know how to use those tools better. And then there's actually 90% of the time they don't need to round trip anyway.
Absolutely, that's great feedback.
That was a long answer, sorry.
No, it's great. You know, we're running close here on time, and so I want to be respectful of that. There's a couple questions just about people that feel like they're stuck in Adobe, which I think that's how pretty much everyone in the world, sorry, Adobe, feels.
That pricing model is it does make you feel stuck. I'm not surprised people feel like that.
So people that are really like ingrained in the After Effects side of things, and maybe the Audition side as well. do you have any pointers for them just to, potentially ease their mind
I mean,
about potential
if
transition?
you are using all those different facets of it, it's very difficult. I mean, it's an important point at the moment. People are, if people have been out of work and their work has dried up and they're freelancing, but they're having to carry on paying subscription fees. And if they stop, they lose access to the projects they've done before. It is an important point. I do think, that's where DaVinci Resolve has a huge advantage. But yeah, everyone's circumstances are very different. And Adobe have very much pleased their, their bank managers by essentially moving the entire globe from basically everyone stealing their software, because let's face it, we all had a copy of something that was given to us by someone. It's just the way it goes, or way it went. And I applaud Adobe on a business level for managing to essentially kill that and start to generate revenue for the software that they were making. They're a software company. You have to remember Blackmagic, Apple, Avid, they're not just software companies. They make a huge amount of money from hardware as well. And so there are different sort of segments to their business, and Adobe don't have that. They are a software maker, and they have to monetize that and make sure that you're paying your subscription. That does unfortunately mean that for some people they're going to be locked into that. And then, like a lot of these situations, I think this, if that's untenable, if that's not possible anymore for people, then they need to kind of break free of that quickly. It's like a plaster, we would say, a band-aid, you would say. You got to rip it off quickly.
Absolutely.
Move on.
Well,
go to Resolve.
Yes. Talking about some of those band-aids, some people have a hard time with color grading in general. And I love that you've seen a solution for that. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about what else you're working on?
Yeah, so back in February, great timing, I launched a new platform called justgrade.it. More and more people are doing a little bit of everything. I know loads of people who you would say, what do you do? And they'd say, I'm a DP, but actually they're getting client work. They're actually, shooting, they're organizing, they're editing, and inevitably, there's always color as well. As a colorist, I've very much spent my color career trying to move and grow in a traditional post-house model. Not that you can see it from here, but we have a client sofa here, we have a client viewing area just behind here. The whole suite is set up so that I can see them, they can't see my screen, they can see the client monitor, and it's a traditional grading suite setup. When people come to us, we're out in the sticks, very deliberately moved out from London, or chose not to be in London and to be more remote. We put people up in a lovely country house hotel when they come for multi-day grades. It's a real experience, but that serves a very small percentage of users, only people that can afford to spend thousands of pounds a day one-to-one in a grading suite. And it felt disingenuous of me to try and continue to pursue that when I myself run a corporate video production company. We're a small team. Luckily, I grade everything that we produce, but not everyone has a colorist that's working for them. And in fact, very few people even know colorists. It's an odd thing. If you ask filmmaker friends of yours, how many professional freelance colorists do you know? They might know one, possibly. And if you ask them how many DPs they know, or editors, they'll know hundreds. So yeah, I thought there needs to be a provision for people who can't afford to sit in the grading suite and the time for a colorist to do something professional, but are actually being asked by their clients to professionally grade the stuff that they're shooting log from all the cameras that they're acquiring in log now. So justgrade.it was designed essentially as a very simple online platform where you simply upload an ungraded film, a finished locked edit ungraded film, and we scene cut it rather than doing a full conform and round trip, because that takes a huge amount of time and it's prone to errors. So to keep costs down, we just get a baked ungraded video. We scene cut it, do contrast balance, color balance, continuity, which is the really big one, because continuity is very hard. It takes a lot of skill and experience to really nail continuity. And we also do, image optimizations like noise reduction, image stabilization, anything where we can help with an image, particularly noise reduction. We use Neat Video. Obviously, we have a proper calibrated color reference environment here with tens of thousands of pounds worth of equipment, reference monitors, which not everyone's going to have. And so the idea was that essentially people could just hit a button, it uploads, and then we do all of that work and send it back to them. The one thing that we don't do at the moment, there's plans for that, but one thing that we don't do at the moment is any creative grade. So I like to think of us as the chef's table of services. I don't know if you've ever seen Chef's Table on Netflix, but it looks just amazing. It's incredibly beautifully produced, all shot on red, incredibly beautifully graded. But if you actually look at it, there's not a look in sight. It's a really good example of what Just Grade It does. It will make things look $1 million without applying a creative look. White is white, black is black, skin looks correct, continuity is in place. I think people who don't understand color grading, if it doesn't have a look, then it can't be color grading, which is absolute nonsense. So Just Grade It is basically a very good professional quality finishing service that's the completely zero interaction. So there's no need at all for you to have any input. You just hit a button, upload it, and then it comes back done. And as I say, launched in February, which is terrible timing, but we've already, I think we've got 130 members on our site now. We've recently started offering a pro membership, which is just a monthly subscription, which unlocks things like live remote grading, creative LUTs, and priority turnaround as well. So our standard turnaround is 5 days, but if you're a pro member, then you get pushed up to the front of the queue. And it's kept us very busy throughout lockdown.
Well, that's a great way to pivot, and that's an amazing story. So keep up the great work. We're so happy to have had you on here today, Ollie, and I'm excited to apply this more to the grounded edit and get us ready for the premiere next week. So we will be doing that on Tuesday night. And it's going to be at 8 p.m. Central Time. We'll be doing it just for viewing experience. We want to make sure it's a good experience. So it's either going to be on YouTube or on Facebook on that one. We don't want to have this whole video have that heavy Instagram crop on this one. So be sure to stay tuned to participate in that. We'll actually have more of the cast and crew on that as well. And so we'll have some time to have some open dialogue. There's been a lot of comments as well on some tips for just, better spatial conforming on that. There's for sure a high level of that needs to be done to make that radio voice sound more radio-y and in different rooms. And so we'll be sure to get all that in there, all of it finalized, everything, all that fat trimmed and everything else that we've talked about today. So thank you again, Ollie. We do have one more stream here today as well, coming up in about 30 minutes. So 3:30 Central Time, we'll be talking to Denver Riddle about, creating some of that look and determining what is appropriate, whether it is to do, more of just that, classic, true to life approach, or creating a little bit more. So we'll see where we land on that. Look forward to having you. And again, Ollie, thank you. Look forward to hearing more about what you're working on and seeing everything. So stay safe over there and have a good one.
Thank you, Brandon. Take care.
Thank you. Okay.